Every member of this species could fit in a single room. Not a population sample, all of them. They live in one crack of water in the Nevada desert, in the hottest region on Earth, in water hot enough to kill most fish outright. And the easy explanation, that they simply adapted to heat, falls apart fast because warm water carries less oxygen, and their entire food supply depends on sunlight that reaches their ledge only part of the year. The pool below them has no measured bottom. They never go down there. And the reason is not the heat. Drive east out of Death Valley, over the state line into Nevada, and the scenery gets worse, not better. The mountains flatten out. The colors go gray and beige. You end up in the Amargosa Valley, which is mostly gravel, creosote bush, and heat rising off the ground in visible sheets. There is nothing here that looks like it could hold a species. Then you come to a fence. It is a serious fence. High, chain link, topped and reinforced, running around a low shoulder of limestone on a hillside that otherwise looks like every other hillside in this valley. Behind the fence, there is a gap in the rock. A slot. Long, narrow, dark at one end. Water sitting in it, absolutely still. That strange saturated blue that water only turns when there is a lot of it underneath. That slot is the entire natural range of a vertebrate species. Not the core of its range, not its last stronghold. Its range. Every wild devil's hole pupfish on this planet is in that water right now, or was hatched from an egg laid in it. You could stand at one end of the opening and see the other end without moving your head, which is why almost everyone gets the first impression wrong. Look at photographs of Devil's Hole, and your brain files it as a pond, a desert water hole. Something shallow, something with a bottom you could touch, something that dries up in a bad year and fills again when it rains. That reading is wrong in every direction, and the way it is wrong is the reason this species exists at all. Devil's Hole is not a pond. It is a window. What you are looking at is not a body of water sitting on the ground. It is the exposed surface of the water table, the top of an enormous flooded cave system in the limestone beneath the valley floor. The rock here is old carbonate, hundreds of millions of years old, and carbonate has a habit that makes it dangerous and interesting. It dissolves. Slightly acidic groundwater moves through fractures, eats away at the stone, and over immense spans of time hollows out passages, chambers, and voids. Most of that never sees daylight. At some point, the ceiling of one of those voids failed and collapsed inward, and the desert got a hole punched into its own plumbing. So the surface pool is not the habitat. The surface pool is the opening. Divers have gone down into it, not casually. This is technical cave diving in warm, low-oxygen water with silt that hangs in the beam and passages that narrow without warning. They have descended past 100 meters. They have gone beyond 400 feet, deep enough that the surface light is a memory, and the passage kept going. Nobody has found the bottom. Sit with that for a second, because it changes the shape of everything that follows. We know the fish. We can count them individually. We can photograph them, weigh the algae they eat, measure the light that lands on the rock they spawn on. And we cannot tell you how deep their own habitat goes. The mapped portion is a partial sketch of a system that continues past where humans can safely follow. There is at least one chamber down there with air in it, sealed off from the sky. The cave keeps its own weather. The cave is also plugged into something much larger. Devil's Hole is not fed by a stream, and it does not drain into one. There is no creek running in. There is no outlet running out. The water in that slot is continuous with a regional groundwater system that stretches across a wide stretch of southern Nevada. Mountain recharge. Slow underground transit. Water that in places has been moving for a very long time before it arrives here. The desert overhead barely contributes. rain in the Amargosa Valley is close to irrelevant. The pool level is set by what is happening in an aquifer the fish will never see and no one can look at directly. That single fact does two opposite things at once, and both of them matter. First, it seals the system. Nothing swims in, nothing swims out. There is no upstream, no downstream, no flood event that carries a stray minnow over the lip and into the pool. For this fish, there has never been a competitor to outfight, a predatory base to hide from, a parasite arriving from another watershed. Whatever is in that hole has been in that hole. The rest of the world is on the other side of solid rock and 40 miles of dry ground. Second, and this is the part that gets uncomfortable later, it means the species has no exit. Not during a drought, not during a crash, not ever. Every other endangered fish you can name has at least a theoretical escape hatch, a tributary, a side channel, an isolated backwater where a few survivors hang on. This one has a room with no doors. People underestimate the hole in the other direction too. In the mid-1960s, a group of young divers went in to explore the deeper passages. 2 of them did not come back. Recovery attempts failed. Their bodies were never found. That is not a ghost story attached to a scenic site. It is a straightforward description of what happens when you take a system that appears small from above and treat its appearance as information. The pool is not a pond that a diver can bottom out in 20 minutes. It is the entrance to something with real volume and real geometry, and the geometry does not care that the surface looks manageable. So here's the setup. Enormous flooded cave. Unknown depth, sealed from the outside world. Warm, still water sitting in stone in the middle of the hottest desert in North America. And now the twist that reorganizes the whole picture. The fish don't use it. Not the depth, not the passages, not the chambers. They have a cave system underneath them that no human has managed to fully explore. And they stay in the top few meters of it, in the sunlit sliver just below the surface. Watch a dive count and you see them hovering in the upper water like they are pinned to an invisible ceiling. Below them, hundreds of feet of habitat they never enter. They are not confined by walls. They are confined by something in the water itself, and it gets tighter than that. Within that thin upper layer, there is one feature that matters more than all the rest of the cavern combined. A shallow limestone shelf just under the surface at one end of the pool. A slab of rock roughly the size of a couple of parking spaces. That is where they spawn. That is where most of their food grows. That is where the counts are taken, because that is where the fish are. A cave system too deep to map. A species living on one ledge in the shallowest corner of it. That mismatch is the actual mystery of Devil's Hole, and it is not a matter of preference or habit. Something about the deep water makes it unusable for them. Not colder, not more crushing. Nothing your instincts would reach for first. Whatever is limiting them is invisible in the footage. You can watch an hour of dive video and never see it, because it is a property of the water, not a feature of the rock. The fence, by the way, is not decoration. This slot is a detached unit of Death Valley National Park, monitored, alarmed, restricted, treated less like a scenic overlook and more like a vault, because a single person climbing that fence on a single night can do measurable damage to a global population. That level of protection tells you something before any biology does. You do not build a vault around a robust system. The protection is old too. Devil's Hole was folded into Death Valley National Monument by presidential proclamation in 1952, a separate parcel, detached from the rest of the park by 40 miles of open desert, added specifically because of what was living in the water. Somebody looked at a crack in the ground in the middle of nowhere and decided it needed federal status. So the desert is not really the danger here. The desert is the wall. It is the reason nothing has ever gotten in. The danger is inside, in the water the fish are sitting in, and it starts with a number most people would read as pleasant. This pool sits at a temperature that would feel like a warm bath to you. Steady, barely changing, month after month, year after year, while the air above it swings between freezing nights and summer heat that has broken records. That stability is not comfort. For a fish, it is a ceiling, and they are living directly against it. Put your hand in that water, and nothing dramatic happens. It is warm, genuinely pleasant, somewhere around 92 degrees Fahrenheit, about 33 Celsius, which is the temperature people pay money for in a hotel spa. If someone blindfolded you and lowered your arm into Devil's Hole, your first word would probably be nice. That reaction is exactly why the temperature here gets misread. It feels mild to us because we are running our own furnace at 98.6 no matter what the room does. We carry our thermostat with us. A fish does not. A fish is the temperature of the water it is sitting in. There is no internal setting, no shivering back up, no sweating back down. Whatever the pool says, the animal's body obeys, all the way down to the chemistry inside its cells. And that chemistry has an unhelpful habit. It speeds up when it gets warmer. As a rough rule across cold-blooded animals, biological reaction rates climb steeply with temperature. A 10°C rise can roughly double the pace of an animal's metabolism. Enzymes work faster. Tissues burn faster. Development accelerates. Everything runs hot, permanently, with no idle setting. So when we say this water is warm, we are not describing the weather. We are describing the speed at which every fish in it is being forced to live. And that speed has a price tag. A body running fast needs more oxygen to keep running, and more food to replace what it burns. Not occasionally, continuously. Every hour of every day, this species is paying a higher operating cost than a fish in a cold mountain stream. In a location where oxygen and food happen to be two of the scarcest things available. Hold that thought because it detonates later. Most freshwater fish would be in serious trouble at this temperature. A trout is stressed well below it and dying not far above. A lot of familiar species start failing somewhere in the 20s Celsius. 33 is not a comfortable operating range for the majority of fish on this planet. It is the region where things start breaking. The Devil's Hole pupfish lives there full time. Not during a heat wave. Not in a bad summer. Always. Now, the obvious reply is that some fish are just tough, which is true, and it is where the picture gets more interesting rather than less. Because there is a second limit that almost nobody thinks about, and it sits lower than the first. An adult fish can usually survive temperatures that its own eggs cannot. Survival and reproduction have different ceilings. Sperm can fail before the animal producing it does. Eggs can stop developing properly or develop into something deformed. At temperatures the parents shrug off. Larvae, newly hatched, tiny, with no reserves, tend to be the most fragile stage in the entire life cycle. The best evidence from work on pupfish and other warm water species points the same direction. The temperature at which a population stops replacing itself arrives before the temperature at which its individuals start dying. That distinction matters enormously here, and it changes what the word limit means. A population does not need to be killed to be finished. It only needs to be prevented from breeding. And Devil's Hole sits close enough to that reproductive ceiling that researchers have spent decades watching for signs the fish are pressed against it. Low hatching success, eggs that fail, larvae that do not make it through their first days. A species can be perfectly alive and still be losing, quietly, one failed clutch at a time. So this is not a story about heat tolerance. It is a story about how narrow the window gets when you demand that an animal not just survive, but reproduce. In water this warm. Here is where the comparison gets unsettling. Pupfish, as a group, are famous for being nearly indestructible. Their relatives are the poster children for extreme tolerance in freshwater fish. Some desert pupfish species handle water that ranges from near freezing to over 40 degrees Celsius. Some live in salinity several times stronger than seawater. Some sit in shallow desert pools that swing 30 degrees between afternoon and dawn, and they simply keep going. If you were designing a group of animals to survive the American Southwest, you would design pupfish. The Devil's Hole pupfish is one of them. It came from that stock, and by the available evidence, it appears to have narrowed. This species does not show the same breadth its relatives are known for. The wide swings, the salinity stunts, the shrugging off of thermal chaos. It has become a specialist in one set of conditions rather than a generalist that can take anything. That looks like a downgrade until you ask why it happened. Evolution does not maintain equipment that never gets used. Tolerance is not free. The physiological machinery that lets a fish handle a 30-degree swing costs something to build and carry. If an animal spends 10,000 generations in water that never swings, the machinery for handling swings becomes dead weight, and dead weight gets shed. The Devil's Hole pupfish did not lose toughness because it got weak. It lost toughness because nothing in its world ever asked for it. Which brings us to the strangest fact about the hottest place on Earth. Above ground, the Amargosa Valley and neighboring Death Valley are violent. This region holds the highest reliably discussed air temperatures ever recorded on the planet, with modern summers pushing past 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and the historical record standing near 134. Winter nights drop below freezing. Ground surface temperatures in July can climb far beyond what the air thermometer reports. Nothing about the surface here is stable. It is one of the most thermally hostile pieces of real estate on the continent. 30 feet below that chaos, the water barely moves a degree. Not because the desert is gentle to it, because the desert never touches it. The pool is not heated by sunlight. Sunlight lands on it for only part of the day and part of the year, and it is not the source. The water arrives warm from below. Groundwater that has been sitting in and moving through deep rock, picking up heat from the earth itself, delivered into the cavern at a temperature set by geology rather than by weather. Beneath that is a vast reservoir of water with enormous thermal mass, and above it is stone. Rock is slow. Water is slow. A summer heat wave that turns the surface of the valley into a griddle produces almost nothing at the level of the shelf. So the single most extreme thermal environment on the planet contains, inside it, one of the most thermally stable habitats you will find anywhere. That is the answer to the first half of the title, and it is not the one people expect. These fish do not survive extreme heat by being champions of temperature swings. They survive it by living in a pocket where the temperature never swings at all. Constant heat is survivable in a way that erratic heat is not, because constant conditions let a body specialize down to a single number. Everything about this animal, how fast it develops, how much oxygen it needs when its eggs succeed, can be tuned to one value and left there. Stability solved the problem, and then it created a worse one. Look at what has been given up. In an ordinary lake, temperature is not a single value. It is a gradient, warm at the top, cooler with depth. A fish that gets too hot swims down. That vertical escape route is one of the most basic survival tools available to freshwater life, and it costs nothing to use. Devil's Hole does not offer it. The heat here comes from below, not above. The deep water is not a cool refuge because the deep water is the source. There is no lower shelf to retreat to, no cold layer waiting at depth, no thermal basement. The entire system runs at roughly one temperature from the surface down into passages nobody has mapped, which means this species has no thermal margin whatsoever. Not a small one, none. It is not living near the edge with a place to step back to. It is living on the edge with the ground removed behind it. Any sustained upward shift in that water temperature does not push them somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. That alone would make this a precarious existence. It is not the reason they stay in the top few meters. Because warm water does something else, something that has nothing to do with heat tolerance and everything to do with basic physics. It is a property of the liquid itself. It applies whether or not a single fish can handle the temperature, and it turns this pleasant 33-degree bath into something closer to a slow chokehold. The water is not trying to cook them. It is trying to suffocate them. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. That is not biology. That is physics, and it does not negotiate. Gases dissolve into liquid more readily when the liquid is cold. Heat the water, and the gas comes back out. You have watched this happen 100 times without registering it. The tiny bubbles that appear on the inside of a glass of tap water left on a counter, the fizz that vanishes from a soda gone warm. Warm liquid cannot hold as much dissolved gas. It sheds it. Run the numbers, and the drop is not subtle. Fresh water near freezing can carry something in the region of 14 or 15 milligrams of oxygen per liter when it is fully saturated. Push that same water up to the low 30s Celsius, where Devil's Hole sits, and the ceiling falls to roughly half that. Not half of what the fish need. Half of what the water is physically capable of holding before you subtract a single breath. That is the ceiling. The actual conditions in that pool are worse. Devil's Hole is not a river. There is no current, no riffle, no waterfall, no wind chopping the surface into foam. Every one of those things is an aeration system. Water breaking against itself, dragging air down, mixing gas into the liquid. This pool has none of it. The surface sits flat under an overhanging wall of rock, sheltered from wind, and the only place where oxygen enters the system in any meaningful way is that quiet interface at the top and whatever the algae produce during the hour's light is available. So the measured oxygen in Devil's Hole is not just low for a warm pool. It is low even by the standards of warm pools. Values reported around the shallow shelf sit in the range of 2 to 3 milligrams per liter, the sort of number that, in a lake or a stream, gets flagged as a fish kill in progress. Many freshwater fish start showing stress below 5. A lot of them are dying by 3. This species lives there, constantly. And that is the good part of the pool. Go down and it gets worse. Because the same stillness that starves the surface of mixing also stops anything from reaching the depths. Oxygen enters at the top and has almost no mechanism to travel downward. No convection driven by temperature differences, since the water is nearly the same temperature all the way down. No current to stir it. Meanwhile, bacteria in the sediment and the deeper water keep consuming whatever is there. Consumption without replacement has one outcome. The deep water in that cavern runs low on oxygen, and by the available measurements, it approaches nothing at all. Now look again at that dive footage. Hundreds of feet of flooded passage that no one has mapped to its end, and a species that stays pinned in the top few meters. There is your answer. They are not avoiding the depths out of preference. They are not confined by rock walls or by some inherited habit. They are held against the ceiling of their own habitat by the only supply of breathable water in the entire system. The cave below them is not habitat. It is a hole full of liquid they cannot breathe. That reframes the earlier picture completely. Devil's Hole looked like an enormous secret world with a few small fish living in the entrance. It is closer to the opposite. The vast, mysterious, unmapped part is dead space. The livable part is a film across the top, a skin of water, sunlit and oxygenated, floating on a column of suffocation. And here is where the two halves of this problem collide. Warm water forces a fish to burn faster, higher temperature, higher metabolic rate, higher oxygen demand. That cost is not optional, and it never lets up. Warm water also holds less oxygen. That is the physics. Put them together, and you get a squeeze from both directions at once. The temperature raises the bill and lowers the available funds in the same motion. Every degree that speeds up their metabolism also strips capacity out of the water they are breathing. There is no version of this habitat where those two forces work in opposite directions and cancel out. They compound. A fish in this pool is running a hot engine on a thin fuel line, permanently, with no way to slow the engine down and no way to widen the line. So what does an animal do about that? Not much, is the honest answer. And that is why the adaptations here are so telling. When you cannot change the environment, you change what you cost it. The most effective thing this fish appears to have done is get small. Devil's hole pupfish are roughly an inch long, around 2 to 3 centimeters, small enough to sit comfortably on a thumbnail. Small bodies have an enormous advantage in low oxygen, and it has to do with geometry rather than toughness. Shrink an animal and its surface area does not fall as fast as its volume does. The gill surface available for absorbing oxygen stays proportionally generous, while the amount of tissue demanding that oxygen drops away. Small also means less mass to move, less muscle to fuel, less total demand per individual. Every observation of these fish points the same direction. They do not chase. They do not sprint across the pool. They hover, slow, deliberate, holding position over rock, moving in short economical bursts rather than sustained swimming. In an oxygen-poor environment, movement is the most expensive thing a fish can choose to do, and this species behaves like an animal that has priced it correctly. There is also the layer effect. The oxygen that does exist is not evenly spread through even that shallow band. It is concentrated at the very top, right at the surface interface, and near whatever algae happen to be photosynthesizing. Hypoxia-tolerant fish in a lot of systems exploit this by working the thin, better oxygenated film immediately below the surface. In a pool where the breathable layer is measured in meters and the good layer within it is thinner still, staying high is not a quirk. It is the difference between functioning and not, which produces one of the strangest dependencies in the whole story. The algae growing on the rocks in that pool are the fish's food. A large share of their diet comes down to the mats and films of algae and the tiny invertebrates living in them. Those same algae are also releasing oxygen into the water while they photosynthesize. So the organism these fish eat is also, in part, the organism that lets them breathe. Their meal and their air supply are the same green layer on the same stone. That sounds elegant until you follow it into the dark. Photosynthesis needs light. When the light goes, photosynthesis stops. And algae, like every other living thing, keep respiring. At night, the mats switch from producing oxygen to consuming it, along with every bacterium in the sediment. Dissolved oxygen in shallow, productive water routinely falls through the night and bottoms out around dawn. The worst hour of the day for these fish is not noon in July. It is the hour before sunrise in the dark, when the only oxygen factory in their world has shut off and everything alive is still drawing on the account. They do not have a deeper layer to escape into. Down is worse. So the picture sharpens again. This is not a species living in a big cave. It is a species living in a thin sheet of water at the top of a cave, breathing an oxygen supply that is thin by physics, thinner by stillness, and thinner still every night, while their bodies are being forced by temperature to demand more of it than a cold water fish ever would. None of that is heat as we imagine heat. Nothing here is being cooked. The mechanism is quieter and considerably meaner. Warm water does not kill fish by burning them. It kills them by taking away the air and then charging them more for it. Which leaves one last question hanging. and it is the one that makes the rest of this story possible. If the livable water is the top few meters, and the oxygen is best where the light is, and the food only grows where the light lands, then the useful part of this habitat is not the pool. It is wherever those three things overlap. And in Devil's Hole, they overlap in exactly one place. One slab of limestone just below the surface, at one end of a slot in the desert. Not the shallow end of their range, the whole functional range of a vertebrate species, compressed onto a piece of rock you could measure with a tape. That shelf is the smallest habitat holding a vertebrate anywhere on Earth. And it is not fixed. It grows. It shrinks. And when it shrinks, so does everything standing on it. Picture a shelf of limestone sitting just under the water at the shallow end of the slot. Flat, pale, tilted slightly, the surface of it furred with a thin green-brown film. Water over it is shallow enough that a person could stand on it and be wet to mid-thigh. That shelf is roughly the size of a small bedroom. Various measurements put it in the neighborhood of 3.5 by 5 meters. Call it something close to 200 square feet, though the exact figure depends on where you draw the edge and, as you will see shortly, on what day you measure. That is the functional habitat of the Devil's Hole pupfish, not the pool, not the cavern, not the top few meters of a flooded cave system, that rectangle. Nearly all spawning happens there, nearly all the feeding. The eggs are laid on it, the larvae develop over it, the juveniles grow on it, the adults spend the productive part of their lives working across it. Fish do venture into deeper water, and spawning has been observed away from the shelf, but the deep pool is not where this species reproduces successfully. The shelf is the engine. Everything else is parking. Say it in a way that lands properly. A vertebrate species, a backboned animal, same broad category as a wolf or an eagle or ewe, depends on a piece of rock smaller than most one-bedroom apartments. There is nothing else like it on the planet. No other vertebrate has a natural range you could sweep with a broom. Why there? Why that particular slab when the pool has other surfaces and hundreds of feet of vertical space? Because it is the only place where everything the fish needs happens to stack up in one spot. Run through the requirements. They need oxygen, which means being near the top of the water column, near the surface interface where gas exchange occurs. They need algae, which means light, which means a surface that the sun can actually reach. They need warmth in the right range for eggs to develop, and they need a substrate, a hard, stable surface where a spawning pair can deposit eggs that will not be smothered in silt or swept off into water that will not support them. Any one of those conditions is easy to find in that cavern. All four in the same square meter is not. The vertical walls of the slot are steep and mostly shaded. The deep water has light, oxygen, and food problems that get worse the further you go. The shelf is the single location where sunlight lands on a horizontal rock surface, in shallow, oxygenated water at the right temperature. It is not the best patch of a large habitat. It is the only patch that works, and everything else is a margin. That produces something you can actually calculate, and it explains a number that confuses people the first time they hear it. The Devil's Hole pupfish population is astonishingly small. Counts have historically run in the low hundreds at the high end, and dropped far, far lower than that in bad years. People hear those figures and assume something is going catastrophically wrong. Disease, pollution, some acute crisis knocking the numbers down. Some of it is crisis. Most of it is arithmetic. A population ceiling is set by how much food its habitat produces and how much space it has to reproduce in. When the productive habitat is a couple of 100 square feet of algae-covered stone, the ceiling is not a few thousand fish. It is a few hundred on a good year, at the absolute top of what that rock can support. This species is not a large population that collapsed to a small one. It has probably always been tiny because the shelf has always been small. which is a genuinely unusual thing to say about an endangered animal. Most endangered species are remnants, fractions of something that used to be much larger. This one appears to be operating close to its natural maximum, and its natural maximum is a number you could count in an afternoon. Now, the part that turns an interesting fact into a survival problem. That shelf is not a permanent feature, not in the way rock usually is. The stone does not move. What moves is the water on top of it. Devil's Hole is the exposed surface of an aquifer, and aquifer levels change. With recharge, with pressure, with what is being pumped out of the ground for miles around. When that water level drops, the shelf does not stay the same. It comes up out of the water. Think about what that means physically. The shelf is not perfectly level. It slopes. Water covering it is measured in tens of centimeters, not meters. Take a few centimeters off the pool level and you do not simply get a slightly shallower shelf. You get a shelf with a smaller wetted area, because the shallow upslope edge, the part where the water was thinnest, is now exposed rock in the air. Lower the level further, and the drying front creeps across the slab. The habitat shrinks from the top down, and it shrinks fast. There is a hard geometric reason for that. On a gently sloping surface, a small vertical change translates into a much larger horizontal change. Drop the level by a hand's width, and you can strip a meaningful fraction of the usable surface. This is not a slow erosion of habitat over centuries. It is a mechanism that can remove a chunk of a species' entire reproductive area within a season, and it operates on a slab you could cross in 3 steps. So the thing that determines how many Devil's Hole pupfish can exist in the world is, quite literally, a water level. A number on a gauge. Move the number down, and the ledge dries. Fewer square centimeters of algae. Fewer places to lay eggs. Fewer larvae surviving. Fewer fish. It is one of the rare cases in conservation where the relationship between an abstract measurement and a living population is not statistical or modeled or inferred. It is mechanical. You can watch it happen. Which is why one of the most closely monitored numbers in American conservation is the water level in a hole in the Nevada desert, marked against a fixed reference point on the rock, tracked for decades. That gauge has been the subject of federal litigation. It has been argued in front of the Supreme Court. And the entire legal fight, stripped of its language, was about whether the top edge of a limestone shelf would stay wet. Hold that. It comes back later. And when it does, it will be worse than it sounds now. There is a second consequence of shelf life that is easy to miss. Concentrating an entire species onto one small surface makes everything about it fragile in ways that have nothing to do with population size. Silt settling on the shelf smothers eggs and buries algae. A disturbance that scours the shelf takes out a breeding season across the whole species simultaneously. Not a portion of it, not one subpopulation, all of it. There is no second shelf holding a backup group. There is no upstream population to recolonize from. In a normal species, a bad event in one location is absorbed by the rest of the range. Here, there is no rest of the range. Every risk that would ordinarily be spread across a river system is stacked onto one slab of rock, and any event that touches that slab touches 100% of the species at once. Look at the footage again with that in mind, and it changes what you are seeing. The dive counts, the divers moving slowly with slates over the pale rock, the small blue fish drifting in and out of the light. That is not a survey of a habitat. That is a survey of a species, in one frame, in one place, on one afternoon. And there is one more constraint on the shelf, the one that pulls everything else out of shape. The whole system runs on algae. The algae run on light. And the light does not simply arrive here the way it arrives on an open pond. Devil's Hole is a narrow slot cut down into rock, with walls rising around it. Sun does not pour into it. Sun has to line up with it, has to reach the right angle in the sky to clear the rim and drop a beam onto that specific shelf at that specific depth. For most of the year, the angle is wrong. So the most productive habitat available to this species, in the sunniest desert on the continent, spends much of the year in shadow. The fish do not have a year. They have a window. Every desert story you have ever heard runs on the same assumption: too much sun. Relentless light, no shade, heat with nowhere to hide from it. That is the image the word desert puts in your head. And for the surface of the Amargosa Valley, it is accurate. 30 feet down in the slot, the problem inverts. Devil's Hole is a narrow opening in a rock face, not a clearing. The walls rise around it. On one side, there is an overhang of limestone leaning out over the water, and the shelf, the 200 square feet that hold the species, sits in the shallow end beneath the geometry of all that stone. Sunlight does not fall into that space. It has to be aimed into it. For a beam to land on the shelf, the sun has to be high enough in the sky and in the right part of its arc to clear the rim of the opening and reach down past the walls at an angle steep enough to actually touch the shallow rock. That alignment does not happen whenever the sun is out. It happens when the sun's seasonal path is high enough, which means it happens for part of the year and not the rest. The best available accounts put that window somewhere in the range of mid-spring to early autumn, with direct sun reaching the shelf for a limited stretch of hours each day inside that period. Outside it, the sun crosses the sky too low. The rim throws its shadow across the water, and the most important piece of real estate in this species' world sits in shade. So here's the sentence that should not make sense. In the hottest, sunniest desert in North America, the limiting resource for an entire species is light. And not much of it, even at its best. A few hours a day for part of the year, angled down through a slot in the rock. That is the energy budget. That is the entire input to the system. Follow where that energy goes, and you see why it matters so violently. Sunlight lands on the shelf and drives photosynthesis in the algae growing there. The algae are the base of the food web. The pupfish graze them directly, and the small invertebrates that also live in the mats become the higher protein part of the diet. More light means more algal growth, more invertebrates in the mats, more food available across the whole slab. Less light means the mats thin out and the invertebrate populations that depend on them thin out too. The algae are also, as we saw, a source of dissolved oxygen during the hours they are photosynthesizing. So the beam of sunlight crossing that rock is not just feeding the fish. It is part of what makes the water above the shelf breathable at all. One angle of sunlight. Food supply and oxygen supply both riding on it. Now put a life cycle on top of that. The population in Devil's Hole does not hold steady through the year. It cycles, and it cycles hard. Counts taken in spring, at the end of the shaded months, come in low. Counts taken in late summer and autumn, after the light window has been open and the shelf has been productive, come in substantially higher, often on the order of 2 to 3 times the spring number. Every year, the same shape. Down through the dark half, up through the lit half. The fish are not simply growing when food is available. They are timing their entire reproductive output to the availability of that beam. Spawning does happen through the year in this species, but it concentrates with a strong push in spring as conditions improve and productivity begins climbing, and activity continuing through the productive season. Larvae hatched into a shelf covered in thick algal mats have food waiting for them. Larvae hatched onto bare, shaded rock in the wrong month have nothing, and larvae with nothing do not become adults. The stakes on that timing are absolute. This is a species that cannot store fat through a lean season the way a bear can, cannot migrate to better feeding grounds, cannot switch prey. It has one food source in one place, powered by one seasonal beam. Reproduction has to be synchronized to that beam or it is wasted. So the annual rhythm of Devil's Hole is not driven by temperature, the way most temperate systems are. The water stays at essentially the same temperature all year. There is no spring warm-up, no winter chill, no thermal cue to trigger breeding. The season here is made of light alone. That is a genuinely rare arrangement. Strip out the temperature signal, strip out rainfall, strip out flow, strip out every seasonal driver that structures life in a normal freshwater habitat, and you are left with a single variable: whether the sun clears the rim. This ecosystem runs on solar geometry, the way a machine runs on a timing belt, which raises a question that has been sitting in the background since the beginning, and it is not a comfortable one. What happens in the shaded months? The mats thin. Productivity falls. The invertebrates in the algae decline. The oxygen contribution from photosynthesis drops away for a stretch of the year, in a pool that was already near the bottom of what fish tolerate. And the population goes down with it. That spring low count is not an accident of sampling. It is what remains of the previous year's fish after a season with the lights off. The species spends a portion of every single year in a slow decline, and then rebuilds when the sun comes back. That is survivable as long as the rebuild is bigger than the decline. It works because the good season is genuinely good. A shelf under direct sun in warm water is a productive little factory, and pupfish reproduce fast enough to exploit it. But look at the structure of that arrangement, and the fragility jumps out. There is no buffer anywhere in the system. No stored resource, no dormant stage, no refuge population sitting somewhere else, no alternative food. The species is running a yearly boom and bust cycle with a population that peaks in the hundreds and troughs far lower. And the entire boom depends on a few hours of angled sunlight hitting a specific slab of rock. Anything that interferes with the shelf during the productive window does not cause a bad month. It costs a year of recruitment across the whole species. Managers have understood this for a long time, and it has produced some of the strangest conservation work being done anywhere. Because when your problem is that a species does not get enough food and light in a hole in the ground, the interventions get very literal. Over the decades, efforts at Devil's Hole have included supplementing food on the shelf and attempting to boost the productivity of the system directly. There have been experiments with artificial lighting and with reflectors intended to redirect sunlight down onto the shelf during the shaded months. A real attempt to extend the growing season by physically aiming sun into a hole. Results across these efforts have been mixed and are still argued over. You will find people who consider parts of the intervention record encouraging and people who consider it inconclusive. What is not argued is why anyone tried in the first place. There is something quietly extraordinary in that image. The most protected aquatic site in the country, a vault in the desert, and inside it, humans trying to hand-deliver photons to a rock. It tells you exactly how tight the margins are. When your management options come down to add food and add light, you are not tuning a habitat. You are life-supporting one. Which brings us back to the animal itself, because a life run on this schedule leaves marks. The fish do not experience any of this as a season. They do not really have one. The rhythm that structures everything about this population, the boom, the bust, the shaded months, the return of the beam, plays out over a span that most of the individuals inside it will never see twice. They arrive in one pass of the cycle and they are gone before the next one opens. So there is no accumulated experience anywhere in that pool. No old fish that has been through a bad year before. No behavior passed down. There is only a body, and whatever that body was built to handle. And it was built for exactly this. Warmth it cannot escape. Oxygen it cannot spare. Food that arrives on a timetable set by the angle of the sun and nothing else. An animal shaped by those three pressures does not end up looking like an animal shaped by a river, and it cannot afford to. Which is why, when you finally get close enough to look at one properly, close enough to see the eye, the head, the underside of the body, The first thing that registers is not what is there. It is what is missing. Get close enough and the first thing you notice is the eye. It is too big. Not grotesquely, not in a cartoon way, but noticeably out of proportion. A dark disc set into a head that is itself oversized for the body behind it. Then the color registers. A breeding male in good condition is metallic blue, bright enough that in the right light he looks like something that belongs on a reef rather than in a hole in the Nevada desert. Females and juveniles are duller, olive and brassy, harder to pick out against the algae. The name comes from behavior rather than appearance. Pupfish got called pupfish because of the way males chase and tumble around one another in shallow water. The movement reminded early observers of puppies playing. It is one of the rare common names in fish biology that describes what an animal does instead of what it looks like, and it is going to matter shortly. The whole animal is about an inch long, 2 to 3 centimeters. You could lose one in a teaspoon, and then you look at where the pelvic fins should be, and there is nothing there. On almost any fish you can picture, a bass, a goldfish, a trout. There is a pair of small fins on the underside, roughly beneath the middle of the body. Those are the pelvic fins, the rough equivalent of hind limbs. They handle braking, pitch, fine trim, holding position. They are standard equipment across bony fishes. The devil's hole pupfish generally does not have them. In many individuals, they are entirely absent. In others, they are present but stunted, reduced to little more than nubs. It is the single most distinctive anatomical feature of the species, and the thing that separates it most cleanly from its relatives. A fish missing a set of paired fins is not a small variation. That is a structure with its own skeletal support and its own musculature. Gone. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, in the productive way, because for a long time the explanation was clean, and now it is not. The clean version says this is adaptation. The fish lives in low oxygen, in warm water, where every calorie costs more than it should. Building and carrying a pair of fins is not free. Bone, muscle, tissue, all of it demands energy to construct and maintain. If those fins are not doing much work in a habitat where the animal barely moves, natural selection will shave them off, the same way it shaves off eyes in cave fish. Trim the equipment you no longer use, and put the savings into staying alive. That reasoning is sound, and it fits everything else about this species. The complication arrived from the refugees, when devil's hole pupfish have been raised in captivity under different conditions, different temperature, different oxygen, different water chemistry. The pelvic fins have shown up more often and better developed. That result is not a small footnote. It suggests that at least part of what defines this species anatomically may be a developmental response to the environment itself, rather than something written cleanly into its genes. Think about what that implies. Fish embryos develop under whatever conditions surround them, and extreme conditions can disrupt the formation of structures. Warm water accelerates development. Low oxygen constrains it. Both can interfere with how a body gets built. Under that reading, the missing pelvic fins are not a design choice made by evolution. They are what happens when you assemble a fish in water this hot and this thin on oxygen. So which is it? Adaptation or side effect? The honest answer is that this is still argued, and the argument matters more than it might sound. If the trait is genetic, it is part of what makes devil's hole pupfish a distinct species and worth protecting as one. If it is largely environmental, then a refuge population raised in easier water starts looking, physically, less like the wild fish it was meant to preserve. The definition of the animal becomes partly a property of the pool. There is also a third possibility, and nobody enjoys it. Small, isolated populations accumulate genetic problems. Inbreeding produces developmental irregularities, asymmetries, malformations, structures that fail to form correctly. Missing fins would be an entirely plausible symptom of that. Researchers have noted deformities in this population that raise exactly this concern. One trait. Three competing explanations: adaptation, environment, or genetic damage. And the evidence does not currently force a choice between them. It may well be some combination of all three. Set the argument aside for a moment and look at the rest of the body, because the rest of it is easier to read. The proportions tell you what kind of life this animal has: large head, large eye, deep and laterally compressed body, small overall size. That is not the shape of a fish built for speed. Sustained swimmers are streamlined, torpedo-profiled, built to minimize drag over long distances. This is closer to the opposite. A compact, high-sided body, optimized for maneuvering in tight space and holding position, not for covering ground. Which is exactly right, because there is no ground to cover. The functional world is a slab of rock a few meters across. Nothing in that habitat rewards a fish for being fast. Everything rewards a fish for being cheap to run. The eye size fits the same logic. This is a species that spends much of the year in shade, in a slot in the rock where direct sun is a seasonal visitor, feeding on algae it has to find on stone. Larger eyes gather more light. In an animal this small, growing a proportionally larger eye is a real investment, and investments get made where the returns are. The behavior lines up too. These fish hover. They hold station over the shelf, drift, feed, and move, in short economical bursts rather than continuous swimming. Watch dive footage and the pace is almost sedate. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. That produces one genuinely strange detail. Hovering, of all swimming behaviors, is the one where pelvic fins earn their keep. They help a fish trim its pitch, brake, hold itself steady in the water column. A fish that spends its life station holding is the last one you would expect to give them up. So either those fins were more expensive than they were useful in this specific water, or their absence is not a choice at all. The anatomy points at the environment either way, which is the point worth holding on to. You cannot look at this animal and separate it from the pool. The body reads like a diagnostic report on the water it grew in. There is one more thing this species appears to have given up, and it is the least expected of all. Pupfish, across the genus, are notoriously belligerent. Males in breeding conditions set up territories on the bottom and defend them with real commitment, chasing, displaying, driving off intruders continuously. In some desert pupfish populations, the aggression is close to constant, and it is one of the traits that makes them recognizable to anyone who has watched them. Devil's hole pupfish have been reported as considerably less aggressive than their relatives, with weaker territorial behavior. The comparison is not perfectly clean, since watching fish in a protected federal site is not the same as watching them in an aquarium, and interpretations vary. The direction of the observation is consistent, though. Follow that logic, and it is not surprising at all. Aggression is expensive. Chasing burns oxygen. In water that holds roughly half the oxygen of a cool stream, a male who spends his energy budget on territorial warfare is spending money he does not have. In a habitat this small, a fish cannot escape confrontation by moving away, so continuous fighting would be continuous cost. The picture that emerges is of an animal that has cut every discretionary expense in its biology. Smaller body, reduced structures, minimal movement, reduced aggression. This species does not survive extreme conditions by being tough. It survives by being austere, by needing less of everything than a fish is normally built to need. That works right up until you ask what got sacrificed to pay for it. Because austerity has a cost. And in this case, the cost is not written in the fins, or the eye, or the temper. It is written into time. An animal running hot in warm water does not just burn more oxygen, it burns through its own life faster. Development accelerates, growth accelerates, aging accelerates. Everything that temperature speeds up includes the countdown. which means the rarest fish on Earth, a species protected by federal law, fenced, alarmed, monitored, argued over in the Supreme Court, guarded like a vault, is also one of the most temporary. Almost none of the fish in that pool today were there 2 years ago. Rare things are supposed to be old. That is the instinct. Endangered species come with a certain image attached, the last of something ancient, slow-moving, long-lived. Giant tortoises with dates carved into their shells, sturgeon older than the people studying them. Rockfish pulled from deep water that were alive before anyone alive today was born. Rarity and longevity feel like they belong together. Devil's Hole pupfish live about a year. Roughly 10 to 14 months for most individuals, some fewer. A small number of them stretch longer, and there are indications they may live somewhat longer than their warm water relatives elsewhere. Longer here still means a fish that hatches, matures, breeds, and dies inside the span of a single lap around the sun. Which produces one of the most unsettling facts in this entire story, and it is not a metaphor. Almost the entire species replaces itself every year, not the population size, the individuals. Take a count today, come back in 18 months, and you are looking at a different set of fish. The species persists, the animals do not. Devil's Hole pupfish is less a group of organisms than a process running continuously in a slot of water, made of different material every pass. The mechanism is the same one that has been driving this story since the beginning. Heat sets the clock's speed. Cold-blooded bodies run at the temperature of their surroundings, and everything in them accelerates as that temperature rises. Development, growth, metabolic rate, the accumulation of cellular wear. At around 33 degrees Celsius, a small fish is running its entire biology at high speed with no way to throttle back. Eggs hatch quickly. Larvae grow quickly. Sexual maturity arrives in a matter of weeks, not years, and the same acceleration that gets them to breeding age fast keeps running afterward, through their tissues, until it finishes them. This is the bill for that beautifully stable temperature, arriving late. The warm water that gave them a habitat with no thermal swings also handed them a life measured in months. There is a general pattern across cold-blooded animals that runs in exactly this direction. Populations of the same species living in warmer water tend to grow faster, mature earlier, and die younger than populations of that species living somewhere cooler. It is not a strict law, and the mechanisms behind it are still argued over. The trend is consistent enough that biologists expect it before they measure it. Devil's Hole sits at the far end of that arrangement because there is no cool season anywhere in it to slow the meter down. A pupfish in a spring-fed pond elsewhere in the Mojave gets winter. Months of lower temperature, lower metabolism, less wear on the machinery. These fish get 33 degrees in January. The meter never stops running, and the bill arrives in under a year. Now, a fast life is not automatically a disaster. It is a strategy, and in the right environment, it is a very good one. Short-lived, fast-breeding animals can rebuild explosively after a bad stretch because they do not need years to get back into reproduction. They exploit good conditions immediately and hard. In an environment where the productive window opens and closes on a seasonal schedule, being able to turn sunlight into new fish in weeks rather than years is exactly the right design. That is why the population can climb from a spring low to an autumn high inside a single year. The species is built to convert a good season into bodies at speed. The problem is what happens on the other side of that trade. A long-lived species has something a short-lived one does not: overlap. Multiple generations alive at the same time, of different ages, at different life stages. If a breeding season fails completely, bad weather, bad food year, a disturbance at the wrong moment, the adults simply survive it and try again next year. The failed cohort is a gap in the age structure, not a hole in the population. A sturgeon that has a catastrophic spawning year has 30 more chances. Devil's Hole pupfish do not have 30 chances. They have roughly 1. There is no deep reserve of older adults waiting underneath the current generation. There is no cohort from 4 years ago holding the line. When the shelf produces well, the population is made of that success. When it does not, there is very little else in the pool to fall back on. So one bad year here is not an inconvenience. It removes a meaningful fraction of the species' entire reproductive output, and the animals that would normally cover the gap are already dead of old age. And 2 bad years in a row is the scenario nobody wants to talk about. Run the sequence. Year 1 goes badly. A poor light season, a disturbance on the shelf, a stretch of unusually low oxygen. Recruitment fails or comes in weak. The population enters the following spring already depleted because the previous generation is aging out on schedule, regardless of how the season went. Now, year 2 also goes badly. The adults from year 1 are gone. The recruits from year 1 were few. There is nothing to breed with and nothing to breed from. That is not a slow decline. That is a population going through the floor inside 24 months. This is the specific reason the monitoring at Devil's Hole is as intense as it is. Divers counting fish twice a year on a slab of limestone is not ceremonial data collection. It is a check on a system that can lose most of itself faster than an annual review cycle can catch. By the time a slow-breeding species shows you a problem, you usually still have time. Here, by the time the number moves, one of the 2 chances is already spent. There is a second consequence of the short lifespan, quieter, and in some ways, worse. Generation time controls the speed of everything genetic. A species that turns over in a year passes through generations at a rate that would take a long-lived animal decades. That cuts both ways, and here both directions are unpleasant. Fast generations mean fast adaptation. Potentially useful if there is genetic variation to work with. But fast generations in a population of a few dozen to a few hundred individuals also mean the erosion of genetic diversity runs at high speed. Inbreeding accumulates per generation, not per year. Genetic drift, the random loss of variants that happens in small populations regardless of whether they are useful, grinds forward every single cycle. A species with a 50-year generation time and 200 individuals loses diversity slowly enough that human intervention has time to work. A species with a 1-year generation time and the same number of individuals is running that same erosion 50 times faster, which brings the earlier question about the missing pelvic fins back into the room. Whatever the cause of the deformities and irregularities in this population, the process that could produce them genetically has been running at maximum speed for as long as this population has been isolated. Every year, another full turn of the wheel. There is something else in the short lifespan that is easy to miss and worth pausing on, because it changes how you should read every count you have heard. The population figures for Devil's Hole pupfish that get reported, the spring lows, the autumn highs, the historic crashes, are not measuring the same animals over time. They are snapshots of a rotating cast. When you hear that the count fell into the dozens in a bad stretch and recovered later, you are not hearing about a group of fish that suffered and then bounced back. You are hearing about a species that came within a small margin of failing to hand itself off, and then managed the handoff anyway. That is the real fragility. Not that individuals die. Every individual of every species does that. It is that this species has to complete a full transfer from one entirely new set of bodies to the next, every 12 months, on a shelf the size of a bedroom, using a light window it does not control, in water that suffocates it every night before dawn. Miss one handoff badly, and you are in trouble. Miss two, and it is finished, which raises the question this has all been circling, and it is the one that turns this from a strange biology story into something closer to a near-miss report. We know the population is small. Small is not a number. How few has it actually gotten? Not in theory, not in a model. In the water, on a real count, in a real year. How close to zero has the rarest fish on Earth actually come? The answer is a number that by every rule of population biology should have been the end of them. 35. That was the count in the spring of 2013. 35 fish, the entire wild population of a vertebrate species in one dive survey on one shelf, small enough that a person could have named every one of them. The number the year before was similar. Numbers in that range showed up repeatedly through the early 2010s, with the population sitting in the 30s and low 40s at the seasonal low point. It was the worst stretch in the recorded history of Devil's Hole, and it followed decades of decline from counts that had been in the hundreds. Sit with the scale of that for a moment, because the instinct is to translate it into something comparable, and there is nothing to translate it into. 35 animals is not a small population by the standards of endangered species. It is smaller than the number of people in a school classroom, smaller than the guest list at a modest wedding. Every living member of a species that has been evolving in that hole for however long, 35, hovering over a slab of rock in the dark. By the standard rules of population biology, that should have been the end. It is worth being precise about where a figure like that comes from, because it is not an estimate in the way most wildlife numbers are estimates. Population figures for large animals are extrapolations. You sample part of a range, model how likely you were to miss something, scale it up, and hand over a number with error bars wide enough to argue inside. Nobody counts every wolf in a mountain range. At Devil's Hole, they count the fish. Twice a year in spring and again in autumn, observers work the shelf from above while divers cover the water below, following a protocol kept deliberately consistent for decades so that numbers taken 40 years apart still mean the same thing. The habitat is small enough and the water clear enough that this comes closer to a head count than to a survey. That consistency is what makes the record valuable. A long dataset is only worth something if the method did not quietly drift. And the count series at Devil's Hole is among the longest continuous records of a single vertebrate population anywhere on Earth. So 35 was not a model output. That was very nearly the actual number of them. There is a body of theory around what that means, and it is not vague. Minimum viable population estimates. The number of individuals below which a population is expected to slide into extinction from random misfortune alone generally run in the hundreds at minimum, and many analyses put the number for long-term persistence far higher, not because of any single threat, but because small populations get killed by a stack of statistical problems that have nothing to do with the environment being hostile. The first is demographic stochasticity, bad luck with individuals. In a population of 35, a run of the wrong sex is born, or a handful of deaths landing on breeding-age adults instead of juveniles, is enough to break the reproductive structure. Large populations average that noise away. Small ones live inside it. The second is inbreeding depression. Fewer individuals, more mating between relatives, more expression of harmful recessive variants, reduced fertility, lower survival, developmental problems. Exactly the sort of thing that could produce deformities and irregular development. Exactly the concern raised by those missing pelvic fins. The third is genetic drift. Variation lost, at random, generation after generation, until the population has almost nothing left to adapt with. And this species turns over annually, which means drift runs at high speed. The fourth is the extinction vortex. The reason these are more dangerous together than separately. Small population produces inbreeding. Inbreeding reduces survival and fertility. Reduced survival makes the population smaller, Smaller population accelerates inbreeding. It feeds itself. Populations that enter it usually do not exit. 35 fish in an unbuffered habitat with a 1-year generation time should have been deep in that vortex. They were not. Counts recovered. Through the mid and late 2010s, the numbers climbed back, and by the early 2020s, spring counts had returned to levels not seen in decades, figures in the range of 175 in spring 2022, and autumn counts pushing beyond that, into numbers that were the highest recorded in more than 20 years. The species did not just avoid the vortex. It walked back out of the range where the vortex is supposed to be inescapable. So what is going on? The most useful answer is that the standard rules were built with a set of assumptions, and Devil's Hole violates almost all of them. Minimum viable population theory is largely built around species in variable environments. Animals that face harsh winters, drought years, predator population cycles, disease outbreaks, competitors, habitat disturbance from storms. The reason a small population dies is usually not that it is small in the abstract. It is that being small removes its ability to absorb the next shock, and in a normal environment, shocks arrive constantly. Devil's Hole does not deliver those shocks. There is no winter in that water. There is no drought that dries the pool because the pool is the top of an aquifer. There are no predators. Nothing evolved in that hole to eat pupfish. There are no competitors. No other fish species has ever colonized it. There is no disease arriving from a neighboring watershed because there is no neighboring watershed connected to it. The temperature is nearly constant. The chemistry is nearly constant. The habitat that has been trying to suffocate this species for its entire existence is also, in a strange way, protecting it by being relentlessly, monotonously the same. That is the loophole. A tiny population can persist far longer than theory predicts if the environment stops producing surprises. Remove the shocks, and you remove most of what actually kills small populations. What is left is genetics, and genetics is slower. Now the other half of the answer, which is less flattering to the fish and more so to the people watching them. The recovery from 35 was not purely natural. That period saw substantial intervention. Refuge propagation programs running in parallel, eggs collected and reared in captivity, supplemental feeding on the shelf, and management adjustments aimed at improving conditions in the pool. How much credit each of those deserves is genuinely debated, and researchers do not agree on the relative weight. Environmental variation over the same period may have done a great deal of the work. What is not in dispute is that this was not a species quietly saving itself while nobody was looking, which produces the uncomfortable version of the same fact. The Devil's Hole pupfish did not survive its worst decade because 35 is a survivable number. It survived because 35 happened inside a habitat with no shocks, with a fast-breeding animal capable of exploiting any good season, and with people intervening directly. Take any one of those away, and the arithmetic changes, and there is a sting in the loophole that is easy to miss. Stability protects this population precisely because nothing has ever tested it. That is not the same as resilience. A system that has never been stressed is not strong. It is untested, and it has been shedding the ability to handle stress for as long as the stress has been absent. This species already appears to have lost the thermal versatility its relatives are famous for. It carries very little genetic variation to draw on. It has no refuge to retreat to and no second population to recolonize from. The moment Devil's Hole starts producing surprises, a temperature shift, an oxygen change, an intruder, the thing that has been keeping this species alive stops applying. And everything that theory predicted about tiny populations arrives at once. The desert has been the wall. That is why they are still here. Walls only work until something gets over them. There is one more implication in that count, and it is the one that takes this story somewhere genuinely strange. A population that spent decades in the low hundreds, dropped into the 30s, turns over annually, and has been sealed in a hole with no gene flow whatsoever, should carry an unmistakable genetic signature. Extremely low diversity, deep inbreeding, the molecular fingerprint of a lineage that has been squeezed through a narrow opening over and over again. It does carry that signature. That part is not controversial. This is among the least genetically diverse vertebrate populations known. The controversy is about what the signature means, because genetic data can be used as a clock. And when researchers ran that clock on Devil's Hole pupfish, it returned an answer that contradicted the geology. Not by a little, by a factor that would rewrite the entire history of how these fish got into that hole. The old story was clean, and it was good enough to hold for decades. 20,000 years ago, this desert was not a desert. During the last glacial period, the Great Basin was wetter and cooler, and the low ground held water. Lakes filled valleys that are now dry, salt flats. Rivers and marshes connected basins that today have no surface water at all. The Amargosa system carried real flow. Fish moved through it. Then the climate turned. The lakes shrank and vanished. The connections dried, and the fish that had been distributed across a wet landscape were left stranded in whatever isolated springs and pools happened to still hold water. One population here, another 20 miles away, each cut off from all the others. That is the standard account of how desert pupfish came to be. A drowned landscape drained, and it left behind fragments. You can still see the pattern on a map. A few miles from Devil's Hole, in the springs of Ash Meadows, there are other pupfish. Populations restricted to their own spring systems, each one its own small headache for taxonomists. In distance, they are neighbors. In terms of gene flow, they may as well be on separate continents, because the ground between them holds no surface water at all, and has not for a very long time. Scatter a group of fish across a wet landscape, then take the water away, and this is the shape you get: isolated pools, each holding a lineage that stopped exchanging genes with every other lineage on the same day. Under that account, the Devil's Hole pupfish has been sealed in that cavern for something on the order of 10 to 20,000 years. Enough time to lose its pelvic fins. Enough time to shed the thermal versatility its relatives kept. Enough time to become a distinct species. It is a satisfying story. It fits the geology. And there is nothing foolish about it. Then the genetics arrived, and the number came back wrong. Genetic dating works on a straightforward principle. Mutations accumulate in a lineage at a roughly measurable rate. Compare two populations, count how much their DNA has diverged, apply a rate, and you get an estimate of how long ago they separated. It is one of the most powerful tools in modern biology, and it has resolved arguments that fossils could not. Applied to the Devil's Hole pupfish, genomic work has produced isolation estimates that come in dramatically shorter than the glacial story requires. Not 15,000 years, estimates on the order of hundreds to a few thousand years, with some analyses landing low enough to raise the possibility that these fish entered Devil's Hole within the last 1,000 years or less. That is not a refinement. That is a different story entirely. Think about what the short timeline implies. If these fish have only been in that hole for a few hundred years, then everything that makes them distinct, the missing pelvic fins, the reduced aggression, the narrowed tolerance, happened at a speed that is difficult to reconcile with ordinary expectations of how fast a vertebrate diverges. It would make this one of the fastest cases of vertebrate differentiation on record. It also raises the obvious question: how would they have gotten in? Devil's Hole has no inlet and no outlet. There has been no surface connection in the modern era. If colonization was recent, the fish had to arrive by some other route. A rare flood event linking systems that are normally separate, or transport by birds carrying eggs, or human introduction. Each of those is possible. None of them is documented, so now there are two evidence sets pointing in opposite directions. And this is the part worth being careful about because it would be easy to write this as scientists were wrong. They were not wrong. Both sides of this argument are using real data, and the disagreement is genuinely technical. The geological and biogeographic case is strong. The pattern of pupfish distribution across the Death Valley region maps convincingly onto the drainage history of the Pleistocene. The degree of morphological difference between Devil's Hole pupfish and its neighbors is substantial. Under normal assumptions about how fast fish change, that difference reads as thousands of years of separation, and the landscape provides a mechanism for exactly that. The genetic case is also strong, and it has an advantage. It is measuring the animals themselves rather than inferring from the shape of ancient lake beds. The dispute sits in the middle, and it comes down to how you calibrate the clock. Mutation rates are not universal constants. They vary between species, between kinds of genetic markers, and, critically, with generation time. A species that turns over annually passes through generations far faster than one that breeds every 5 years. And if a molecular clock has been calibrated using species with slower life cycles, applying it to an annual fish will systematically distort the result. Devil's Hole pupfish live about a year. That is precisely the sort of feature that makes calibration difficult. There is a second complication that cuts even deeper. Small populations lose genetic variation quickly through drift. A lineage repeatedly squeezed through bottlenecks of a few dozen individuals can end up looking, genetically, like a much younger population than it is. Because the historical signal has been scrubbed out of it. Diversity can be low because a population is recent, or because it has been very small for a very long time. And separating those two explanations from the data is one of the genuinely hard problems in population genetics. This species has spent an unknown number of years in a hole with a carrying capacity in the low hundreds and repeated crashes into the dozens. If any population on Earth was set up to have its own history erased, it is this one. Which leaves the honest position. We can describe these fish in extraordinary detail, count them individually, measure their water to fractions of a degree, and still not tell you with confidence whether they have been in that hole since the last ice age or since sometime in the last few centuries. That is a strange thing to be uncertain about for a species this closely monitored, and the uncertainty is not academic. It runs directly into policy. Endangered species protection in the United States operates on species and subspecies units, and questions about how distinct a population is and how long it has been separate feed into how it gets classified and defended. A lineage isolated for 15,000 years is unambiguously its own thing. One that may have arrived a few centuries ago invites arguments that would be made by people who would prefer the water in that aquifer be available for other uses. The biology has the same problem in reverse. If the divergence is ancient, the missing pelvic fins and narrowed tolerances look like adaptation refined over deep time. If the divergence is recent, they look much more like the fingerprints of extreme inbreeding and developmental stress in a population that has been struggling since it arrived. The same animal. 2 readings. The evidence currently supports both, and picking between them is not something a documentary gets to do. What can be said is that the debate itself reveals something about how this place works. Devil's Hole is a system that destroys information. It has no fossil record of its own fish. It has no connected populations to compare against because everything nearby was severed from it. It has a population small enough and fast enough to erase its own genetic history through drift. And it sits inside a landscape whose surface water disappeared thousands of years ago, taking the evidence of any connection with it. We are trying to reconstruct the history of a species using a lineage that has been continuously overwriting its own records. There is one thing both camps agree on completely, and it is the part that matters most for what comes next. However they got there, they are there now, and they are alone. No gene flow in, no gene flow out. Whatever variation is in that pool is all there will ever be, and it has been narrowing for as long as they have been sealed in. A species in that condition survives on one thing, that its environment keeps behaving exactly as it always has, which is a reasonable bet for a pool of water in solid rock, in a desert, in the most stable habitat within 1,000 miles. Right up until you learn that the pool does not behave that way at all. That this sealed, protected, monotonous little system is physically connected to events on the other side of the planet, and that a fault line rupturing thousands of miles away can reach into Devil's Hole and scour that shelf clean while the fish are still spawning on it. Watch the surface of Devil's Hole on an ordinary day and nothing happens. There is no current. The water sits flat under the overhang, so still it takes a moment to register that it is water and not glass. Then, occasionally, without warning, the whole pool starts to move. Not ripple, move. The water surges up the rock wall at one end, high enough to strip the surface bare, and then rushes back down and up the other end, sloshing back and forth like a bathtub someone has just stepped out of. In severe events, the water has been observed climbing the walls by a couple of meters, sediment ripping off the shelf in clouds, waves breaking across the shallow rock and dumping over the edge into the deep. It can go on for tens of minutes, sometimes longer, and the trigger is not local. There is no earthquake beneath Nevada when this happens. The ground under the observation platform is often perfectly steady. The trigger is a fault rupturing on the other side of the planet. This phenomenon is called a seiche, a standing wave that develops in an enclosed body of water when it gets pushed at the right frequency. Every enclosed basin has a natural period at which it sloshes, set by its size and shape, and if you nudge it in rhythm with that period, the wave builds. It is the same reason water sways in a carried glass, and why a swimming pool moves in an earthquake. What makes Devil's Hole extraordinary is how efficiently it does this. Large earthquakes send seismic waves all the way through and around the Earth. The long-period surface waves, the slow ones, with periods measured in tens of seconds, travel enormous distances and lose relatively little energy on the way. By the time they arrive somewhere thousands of miles from the epicenter, they are far too gentle to knock a picture off a wall. A person standing on the ground would feel nothing. Devil's Hole feels them. The geometry of that flooded slot, connected to a large body of water in rock, gives it a natural period that lines up well with the long-period seismic waves generated by major distant quakes. The pool acts like a tuned instrument for earthquakes it has no business detecting. The energy arrives, matches the basin's rhythm, and the water starts to swing. Events of this kind have been recorded there repeatedly, tied to major earthquakes around the Pacific and beyond, including large ruptures in Alaska, Japan, Chile, Mexico, and Indonesia. It is one of the reasons the site has been instrumented for so long. This hole in the Nevada desert functions, incidentally, as a seismic sensor. None of that was discovered by standing there watching. It came out of the instruments. Devil's Hole has carried water level monitoring equipment for decades, installed to track the aquifer and not the earthquakes. What that equipment kept recording were sudden violent excursions in the water level with no local cause, bursts appearing in the record on days when nothing had happened anywhere near Nevada. Line those bursts up against global earthquake catalogs, and the matches come out clean, including the delay, which corresponds to how long seismic waves need to cross that much of the planet. So most of the evidence for this exists as a trace on a chart, a flat line running for months, then a sudden run of oscillation decaying slowly back to nothing, while 3,000 miles away a coastline was moving. Now put the fish back in the frame. The entire reproductive habitat of this species is a shallow shelf near the surface, at one end of that slot, holding algae, eggs, and larvae. A seiche does not sweep through the deep water where nothing lives. It concentrates exactly where the water is shallow and the geometry forces it, over the shelf. So a fault ruptures in Alaska. Seismic waves cross a continent. 20 minutes later, water surges across 200 square feet of limestone in the Amargosa Valley, tears the algal mats off the rock, throws sediment into suspension, and washes eggs and larvae off the only reproductive surface a species has. The connection is absurd, and it is real, and it produces something almost no other species on Earth has to deal with. Most animals face local risks: weather, predators, disease. This one is exposed to global tectonics. A rupture on a subduction zone across an ocean can reach into that pool and take out a portion of a breeding season. Documented events have produced exactly that pattern. Following major seiche events, observers have reported sediment stripped from the shelf, algal cover reduced, and impacts on eggs and larvae present at the time. In a species where the entire annual recruitment depends on what happens on that slab, an event landing in the wrong week is not a curiosity. That is the version of this story that gets told, and it is accurate as far as it goes. It is also incomplete, and the correction is the part worth staying for, because there is a strong argument that these events are not purely destructive, and that in the long run, this species may need them. Look at what a seiche physically does. It agitates a body of water that never otherwise moves. It scours accumulated sediment off the spawning surface. It mixes the water column, dragging oxygenated surface water down and bringing deeper water up. It removes senescent algal mats and clears bare rock. Now consider the alternative. Devil's Hole, with no disturbance at all, is a pool where silt settles continuously onto the shelf, where mats grow old and thick, where the water stratifies, and the surface layer sits undisturbed. Sediment accumulation on a spawning surface is not neutral. It smothers eggs and reduces the area of clean rock available. Stagnation reduces mixing in a system that already has an oxygen problem. There have been observations following seiche events of increased pupfish activity and of spawning behavior on freshly cleared rock. The interpretation is not settled, and researchers continue to argue about the net effect of any given event. The plausible reading is that a seiche functions as a reset, costly in the moment and possibly necessary over time, which is a genuinely uncomfortable idea because it means the same process is both the maintenance and the damage. There is no clean separation here between the thing that harms this species and the thing that keeps its habitat functional. The shelf gets cleaned by the only force in that system capable of cleaning it, and that force also removes whatever happens to be living on the shelf at the time. Timing decides which one you got. An event in a quiet period clears the ground. An event during peak spawning takes out the year's production. The species does not get to choose. It cannot detect a fault rupturing in Chile and delay its breeding. Step back and the shape of this becomes clear. This is supposed to be the most isolated aquatic habitat in North America. Sealed in rock, cut off from every watershed, no inlet, no outlet, no predators, no competitors, no disease from outside, protected by 40 miles of desert and a federal fence. And it is wired into the seismic behavior of the entire planet. The isolation was never as complete as it looked. Rock does not block seismic energy. Rock transmits it. The very thing that walls this species off from the biological world is a superb conductor of the physical one. Devil's Hole is sealed against everything alive and completely open to everything geological. That reframes the protection around the site. You can fence a hole. You can alarm it, monitor it, restrict access, prosecute intruders. There is no version of that fence which stops a subduction zone, which leaves one more thing about seiches worth noticing, and it points at what comes next. A siege only happens because Devil's Hole is not an isolated pocket of water. It is the exposed surface of something much larger, a body of water extending down into passages nobody has mapped and outward into rock across a wide region. The pool sloshes because there is enough water connected to it to sustain a standing wave. That connection is what makes the seismic sensitivity possible. It is also the single greatest vulnerability this species has, and it has nothing to do with earthquakes. Because whatever the aquifer does, the pool does. The water level in Devil's Hole is not set by anything happening in Devil's Hole. It is set by the pressure in a groundwater system spread beneath a large stretch of southern Nevada, a system that does not care about fences, and that human beings have direct, mechanical, immediate access to. You do not need to reach the fish to threaten them. You only need a pump, and enough distance to make it look unrelated. The desert overhead is not the source. That is the first thing to get straight. Rainfall in the Amargosa Valley runs to a few inches a year. Evaporation there vastly exceeds it. If Devil's Hole were fed by local rain, it would be dry, and it would have been dry for a very long time. The water in that slot comes from somewhere else entirely, and it arrives from below. Devil's Hole is a window onto a regional groundwater flow system, a body of water moving slowly through carbonate rock beneath a large stretch of southern Nevada, recharged mainly in mountains, well to the north and east, traveling underground across distances measured in tens of miles. It surfaces at Devil's Hole and at the springs of Ash Meadows nearby because the geology forces it up. That is the entire supply. And this water is old. Isotopic dating of groundwater in the regional carbonate system returns ages on the order of thousands of years, with some estimates reaching considerably further. The water sitting on that shelf today fell as rain or snow before the pyramids were built, which sets up the arithmetic that governs everything. That aquifer takes millennia to fill. A pump can empty it in a season. The 1960s made that concrete. Agricultural development came to the Amargosa Valley. Irrigated fields in the desert, wells drilled into the carbonate aquifer, water pulled out at industrial rates. The wells were not at Devil's Hole. They were miles away on private land, drawing from what looked like an unrelated resource. The pool started dropping, not a little. Through the late 60s and into the early 70s, the water level in Devil's Hole fell steadily, and the effect on the shelf was exactly the geometry described earlier. The shallow slab came up out of the water. The wetted area shrank. The algal mats that fed the population thinned as the surface they grew on dried, and the spawning area contracted toward nothing. Nobody was doing anything to the fish. Nobody went near the hole. Farmers turned on pumps 20 miles away and a species began going dry. There is a photograph that captures this better than any measurement. The shelf partially exposed. Pale limestone in the air where water should be. A small band of remaining water at the deep edge. It looks like a receding tide. It was the reproductive habitat of a vertebrate species going out of service. What happened next is one of the strangest legal fights in American environmental history, and it went all the way up. The federal government sued to limit groundwater pumping in the valley in order to protect the pool. The case reached the Supreme Court, decided in 1976 as Capillart v. United States, and the court ruled unanimously for the government. The reasoning drew on the reserved water rights doctrine. When the federal government set aside Devil's Hole as part of a national monument in 1952, it implicitly reserved enough water to fulfill the purpose of the reservation. That purpose included the pup fish. The court held that pumping could be limited to maintain the water level. A minimum water level was established for Devil's Hole, tied to a fixed marker on the rock, and pumping in the surrounding valley was restricted to hold it. Read that again because it is a genuinely unusual outcome. A 1-inch fish in a hole in the desert produced a Supreme Court decision that constrained property owners' access to groundwater across a valley. It is one of the most significant precedents in Western water law, and it exists because a shelf of limestone was drying out. The fish became a legal instrument, not a symbol, an instrument. Their survival was the mechanism by which a limit on water extraction was made enforceable, which is not entirely comfortable, and it is worth being honest about why. The ruling worked because the pupfish gave the government standing to act. That means the protection of this species is, structurally, tied to a legal argument, rather than to physical safety. Legal arguments get relitigated. Pressure to develop groundwater in that valley has never gone away, and applications to pump more of it continue to appear. The pool is not protected by rock. It is protected by a court order and a water level gauge. And the pupfish are not the only thing riding on that water. The same regional flow system feeds the springs of Ash Meadows next door, and those springs support one of the densest concentrations of species found nowhere else in the United States. Plants, snails, insects, and several other fish, all restricted to a handful of desert springs fed from the same source. The fish in that hole are the most famous tenant of the aquifer. They are nowhere close to the only one, which changes what a falling water level actually represents. It is not one species being squeezed. It is a whole cluster of narrowly restricted organisms drawing on a single underground supply, none of which has anywhere else to go. The difference is that most of them have no gauge. There is no marker on a rock tracking the condition of a spring snail. No Supreme Court decision built around a desert plant. The pupfish are simply the part of that system we happen to be able to count. Now, the water level recovered after the ruling, but not fully and not permanently. Levels through the following decades did not return to where they had been before the pumping began, and long-term monitoring has shown continued gradual decline in the regional system. The line on that rock is not a comfortable margin above the shelf. It is close. This is where the mechanics get merciless, and it connects straight back to the shelf. The relationship between aquifer level and pupfish population is not a correlation somebody found in a dataset. It is a physical chain with no missing links. Regional groundwater pressure sets the water level in the pool. The water level sets how much of the shelf is submerged. The submerged area sets how much algae can grow and how much spawning surface exists. Those set how many larvae are produced. That sets the population. Every step in that chain is direct. Move the first number, and the last one moves, which means you can express the carrying capacity of a species, the maximum number of animals of that kind that can exist on Earth, as a function of a water level reading. That is not how conservation usually works. Most of the time, the connection between human activity and species decline is diffuse, delayed, mediated through a dozen ecological steps that make responsibility easy to argue about. Here, it is a gauge on a wall. There is a further problem, and it is the one that makes the long term genuinely uncertain. The regional aquifer is not fed on any timescale that matters to us. Recharge happens through mountain precipitation, slowly, and the residence time in the system is measured in thousands of years. A drier climate in the recharge areas does not produce an immediate response in the pool. It produces a slow deficit that takes centuries to fully express and centuries more to reverse, which means that whatever is happening now to the recharge of that system, the consequences arrive for Devil's Hole gradually and cannot be undone within any human planning horizon. Water withdrawn from a system like this is not borrowed. Functionally, it is gone. So the deepest threat to this species is not the desert heat that gets the top billing. It is not the oxygen. It is not even the earthquakes. It is a slow decline in the pressure of a body of ancient water that no one can see, driven by extraction and climate in a region far larger than the site itself, expressing itself as a few centimeters on a marker on a limestone wall. The fish have no perception of it. There is no signal in the water, Nothing changes in the temperature, the chemistry, or the light. The shelf simply gets a little shallower at the upper edge, and a little more of it dries, and the ceiling on the species drops by a number nobody in the pool can detect. That is the quiet threat. It works on a timescale of decades, and it operates through a mechanism that cannot be fenced. Which brings up the obvious question, and it is the one that turns the last part of this story dark. If the danger comes from outside, what is the fence for? The answer is that the quiet threats are not the only ones. That aquifer is a slow problem. There is a faster category: direct, physical, and immediate. And Devil's Hole has been on the receiving end of it more than once. Things have gotten into that hole. Some of them arrived on purpose. On the night of April 30th, 2016, 3 men climbed the fence. They had been drinking, and they were shooting at things in the desert. They got over the barrier, past the signs, into the enclosure that guards the entire natural range of a vertebrate species. Surveillance cameras recorded it. One of them stripped down and got into the water. He waded onto the shelf. That is the sentence. A drunk man in the dark, standing on the 200 square feet of limestone that hold the reproductive future of an entire species in the middle of the spawning season. They left beer cans in the pool and vomit on the rock. Afterward, a dead pupfish was found on the shelf. The men were identified and prosecuted. There were federal charges, guilty pleas, prison time for one of them. The site's security was upgraded. More cameras, more detection, more barrier. The kind of hardening you would expect around infrastructure rather than around a pool of water. All of it aimed precisely at the failure that had already occurred, which is how physical security works everywhere. It gets built out of the last incident. That is the resolution, and it is not much of one, because the thing worth noticing is not the crime. It is the exposure. 3 men with no plan, no equipment, and no idea what they were standing on came within one careless boot of doing measurable damage to a global population, not to a habitat, to a species. Every egg on that shelf that night represented a share of the year's recruitment, and the year's recruitment is nearly all this species has. There is no other vertebrate on Earth where a single trespasser can do that, which is why the fence exists, and why the response to that break-in was not proportionate to 3 drunk men. It was proportionate to what 3 drunk men could have accomplished. The 2016 event is the one that made the news. It is not the most serious intrusion this pool has experienced. That distinction belongs to something small, unglamorous, and impossible to prosecute. In the late 1990s, a beetle turned up in Devil's Hole that had not been there before. A predatory diving beetle of the genus Neoclepioidites, not previously recorded from the site. Diving beetles are aggressive aquatic predators. The adults hunt. The larvae are worse, elongate, jawed, ambush predators that take prey substantially larger than themselves. In a small water body, they can be a dominant force. Nobody knows exactly how it arrived. The likely routes are the ones you would expect: transported on equipment or on an animal, or simply flying in, since many diving beetles disperse by air between water bodies. Devil's Hole is sealed against fish. It is not sealed against something with wings. The beetles established. They are still there. Their impact is genuinely debated, and it should be. Direct predation on pupfish larvae by these beetles has been observed, and their presence overlaps with the period of the population's deepest decline. Whether they were a primary driver of that decline, a contributing pressure, or a secondary factor riding on top of low food availability is not something the evidence resolves cleanly. Researchers disagree. Scale the insect against the fish, and the shape of the threat gets clearer. Pupfish larvae are a few millimeters long, slow, and concentrated in exactly one place: the shallow, warm, sunlit edge of the shelf, which is also the best hunting ground in the pool, A predatory beetle larva working that strip is not picking off scattered individuals across a river system. It is operating inside the nursery, in the only nursery, during the only productive window of the year. There is a compounding problem on top of that. Beetles do not only take larvae, they compete for the same small invertebrates living in the algal mats that the adult fish depend on for the higher protein part of their diet. Predation and competition arriving inside the same insect, in a system that has no spare food in it. What is not debated is the structural point. For however long this species has existed in that hole, it faced no predators. None. There was nothing in that water that hunted pupfish larvae, and the species had no need to evolve any defense against being hunted. Then, within a few decades, a predator arrived and could not be removed. That is what happens to an animal that has been protected by isolation. Isolation does not produce toughness. It produces the opposite. A species that has never needed a defense does not have one. And the first time something gets past the wall, it walks into an ecosystem with no immune response whatsoever. Attempts have been made to control the beetle population. Removal efforts have been conducted. Eradicating an established aquatic insect from a cave pool connected to an unmapped flooded system is not a solvable problem in any straightforward sense. You cannot drain it, you cannot poison it, and you cannot be certain what is sitting in the passages below the part you can reach, so the hole is not sealed. It never was. It was quiet, and quiet got mistaken for sealed, which is a mistake that only becomes visible after something has already walked in. There is a third category of intrusion, and it is the one that makes conservation at this site genuinely difficult, because the intruders are the people trying to help. Counting these fish requires divers in the water. Twice a year, biologists enter Devil's Hole, descend along the shelf and into the upper pool, and count individuals by hand. That data is the backbone of everything known about this population. The trend lines, the crash detection, the evaluation of every management decision ever made there. It also means people in the habitat. A diver on or near the shelf can disturb sediment, dislodge eggs, disrupt spawning behavior, and stir the water in a system where the shelf's condition is everything. Egg collection for the refuge program means physically removing eggs from the wild population, eggs that would otherwise have hatched in the pool. Supplemental feeding means introducing material into a system whose chemistry is finely balanced. Every one of those interventions is defensible. Collectively, they represent a real and repeated disturbance to the only habitat this species has. Think about what an hour of dive time actually is in a place like this. Fins moving near sediment that has been settling undisturbed for months. Lights in a slot that spends most of the year in shade. Human bodies displacing water in a column that otherwise does not move at all unless the far side of the planet shifts. The people managing Devil's Hole are aware of this and have structured the work around it. Limited surveys, restricted access, protocols designed to minimize contact. There is no way to reduce it to zero. To know whether the population is crashing, you have to look. Looking has a cost. The cost is paid by the population you are trying to protect. That is the trap this site sits in, and it does not have a clean solution. In a normal conservation program, you can study one population and leave another undisturbed. Here there is one population. Every research decision is made on the entire species at once. Put the three intrusions side by side, and the picture is clear. A fence stops people. It did not stop three men who decided to climb it, and it never stopped a flying insect. A court order protects the water level. It does not protect the shelf from a diver's fin or a beetle larva. Every layer of protection at Devil's Hole addresses one route in and leaves the others open, which produces the conclusion that has driven conservation policy at this site for over 50 years. and it is a bleak one. Devil's Hole cannot be made safe. Not because the people responsible are failing, because the thing they are protecting is a single population, in a single pool, with a single reproductive surface, exposed to threats that arrive by air, by water, by tectonics, by aquifer, and occasionally over the fence at 2 in the morning. You can reduce the probability of any individual failure. You cannot reduce the consequence, because the consequence is always the same, all of it. So if the original cannot be secured, the obvious move is to build a second one. Take some fish out, put them somewhere else. Establish a backup population in a controlled facility where the beetles cannot reach, the fence cannot be climbed, and the water level is set by a valve instead of an aquifer. Standard conservation practice, done successfully for hundreds of species. That effort began decades ago, and it failed repeatedly for reasons that turned out to be far more interesting than anyone expected, because every attempt to copy Devil's Hole revealed another variable that nobody had known was on the list. Take some fish out and breed them somewhere safe. Simple. Captive propagation is routine work. It has been done for hundreds of endangered species. Condors, black-footed ferrets, dozens of fish. Establish a controlled population, buffer it against catastrophe. And if the wild population fails, you have a source to restock from. The techniques are mature. For the Devil's Hole pupfish, it did not work. Refuge attempts began decades ago, and the pattern repeated with grim consistency. Populations were established in artificial habitats. They persisted for a while. Then they failed. Through die-offs, through equipment failures, through gradual decline, through problems that were not always diagnosed before the population was gone. Some refugees lost their fish to a pump failure or a system malfunction. Some declined slowly for reasons that were never fully pinned down. And in some cases, the fish survived, but the population became compromised, including hybridization with other pupfish that got into the system, which produces something that is no longer the species you were trying to save. These were not careless efforts. They were purpose-built structures, plumbed with water drawn from nearby springs, designed to imitate the shelf, monitored and maintained for years at a time. The failure modes are what should worry you because most of them are mundane. A pump stops over a weekend. A seal goes. Water chemistry drifts a few percent and nobody notices until recruitment quietly stops happening. In a wild population, those events get absorbed. In a sealed artificial habitat holding a few dozen fish, a mechanical fault is an extinction event for that population. That is the awkward part of the backup logic. A refuge removes exposure to earthquakes, trespassers, and aquifer decline, and replaces it with exposure to hardware. You trade a set of natural risks you cannot control for a set of engineering risks you can, right up until a valve fails at 3 in the morning. Multiple attempts, multiple failures, for a species with a wild population that had dropped into the 30s. The reason this kept happening is the important part, and it is not incompetence. Look at what Devil's Hole actually is as a set of conditions. Water at a near constant temperature in the low 30s Celsius, held there by geothermal input and enormous thermal mass. Dissolved oxygen at levels that would be lethal to most fish, stable at that low value. A specific water chemistry? This is carbonate groundwater with its own dissolved mineral profile, developed over thousands of years of contact with limestone, light arriving at a particular angle for part of the year, driving a specific algal community, a food web built from those algae and the invertebrates in them, a shelf of a particular shape and depth. Now try to reproduce that in a tank. Temperature is easy, chemistry is harder, but manageable. The oxygen is where it gets strange, because the requirement is not provide adequate oxygen. It is provide inadequate oxygen precisely and hold it there. Standard aquaculture is built entirely around keeping oxygen high. Here the target is a value that fish husbandry manuals treat as an emergency, and the food web is the real problem. You cannot buy the algal community from Devil's Hole. It is a specific assemblage adapted to that light regime, that chemistry, that temperature. The invertebrates living in those mats are part of the diet, and getting them established in an artificial system means building an ecosystem, not stocking a tank. Every failed refuge exposed another item on a list nobody had finished writing. That is the honest lesson of the refuge program, and it is more interesting than the failures themselves. This species turned out to be a set of relationships with a habitat rather than an animal you could pick up and move. Understanding it well enough to describe it was not the same as understanding it well enough to rebuild it. So the approach changed. If a tank cannot hold them, build the hole. The Ash Meadows Fish Conservation Facility opened in 2013, roughly a mile from Devil's Hole, at a cost in the region of $4.5 million. Its centerpiece is a large tank holding something on the order of 100,000 gallons, an engineered replica of the upper portion of Devil's Hole, including a recreation of the shallow shelf, built to match the geometry, the depth profile, the temperature, and the water chemistry of the original. It is one of the more remarkable structures in American conservation, and what it is for is worth stating plainly. It is a copy of a hole in the ground, built because the hole in the ground could not be secured, for a fish that would not survive anywhere else. The facility has worked in ways the earlier refuges did not. A refuge population has been established and maintained there, propagated from eggs collected in the wild, and it has produced fish. Having it in place through the years, when the wild count sat in the dozens, meant that the species had, for the first time, something behind the wild population. That is a genuine achievement, and it should be counted as one. It also comes with a complication that is only now becoming clear, and it is the sort of problem that has no clean fix. A refuge population is not a frozen sample. It is a living population, breeding, under selection, in an environment that is a very good copy, but not an identical one. Selection in the refuge acts on whatever conditions exist in the refuge. Any difference between the tank and the pool, however small, in chemistry, in flow, in food, in the intensity of any pressure, is a difference in what gets favored. The pelvic fin observation from earlier is the visible edge of this. Captive-raised Devil's Hole pup fish under different conditions have shown pelvic fins more often. Whatever the mechanism, the copy does not look exactly like the original. Run that forward across generations in a species that turns over annually, and the implication is uncomfortable. A backup population maintained for decades is not preserving a snapshot. It is running its own evolutionary experiment in parallel, and the longer it runs, the less certain anyone can be that what is in the tank is still the thing that was in the pool, which raises the question the entire refuge program exists to avoid asking. If the wild population were lost, and the refuge fish were used to restock Devil's Hole, would that be a recovery or a reintroduction of something that had already started to become a different animal? There is no consensus answer, and the managers involved are well aware of the problem. The strategy is to keep the wild population as the primary and the refuge as insurance, precisely because the copy cannot be allowed to become the reference. It also means the refuge has to be managed as a genetic problem and not only as a plumbing problem. Which fish breed? How often new eggs are brought over from the pool? How much of the wild population's remaining variation makes it into the tank? Every one of those decisions shapes what the backup will be worth if it is ever needed. Step back from the tank and there is something larger visible here. We built a $4.5 million replica of a natural habitat, And the thing that was hard to build was not the animal. Pupfish will breed. They are not delicate in that sense. The hard part was the pool, the light, the algae, the oxygen held deliberately low, the chemistry, the shelf. For most of this story, the environment has looked like the antagonist. Heat pressing on the reproductive ceiling, warm water stripping out oxygen, a slot in the rock rationing sunlight, a shelf that shrinks when an aquifer drops. The refuge program inverted that. It demonstrated that the environment is not something this species endures. It is what this species is made of. Take the fish out of that specific combination of pressures, and it stops being quite the same fish, physically, within a generation. That is the strongest argument anyone has made for what Devil's Hole actually is, not a container holding a rare animal, a set of conditions producing one, continuously, and only there. Which means the fence, the court order, the water level gauge, the twice-yearly counts, the $4.5 million of replica plumbing, all of it is aimed at maintaining a process rather than protecting a thing. And it leaves one question standing, the one this whole story has been walking toward. If the animal is the environment, and the environment is the top of an aquifer nobody can see, then what exactly are we watching when we watch those fish? Because they are telling us something. They have been telling us something for 50 years. Most of it was never about the fish at all. Go back to the beginning of this and remember what the title claimed. The rarest fish on Earth, surviving in the hottest place on Earth. Both halves are true. Both halves are also the least interesting thing about what is actually happening in that pool. Start with the heat, because that is the part everyone reaches for first. The mental image is a fish enduring extreme temperature, a tough little animal winning a fight against the desert. That is not the story. The desert never touches them. 30 feet down, the water sits at a temperature set by the Earth's own heat and an aquifer with enormous thermal mass, and it holds that value while the surface above swings between freezing nights and 125-degree afternoons. The most thermally violent landscape in North America contains inside it one of the most thermally monotonous habitats you will find anywhere. These fish are not beating the desert. They are hiding from it, in the one place it cannot reach, and the warmth they are hiding in is not a comfort. It is a cost. It runs their metabolism at a rate they cannot throttle. It pulls half the oxygen out of the water they breathe. It compresses their lives into about a year. Every advantage the stability gives them arrives attached to a bill. Now do the same with rarity. 35 fish in 2013, 175 in spring 2022, counts that fit on a whiteboard. It reads like a species that has been beaten down to a remnant, the last survivors of something that used to be larger. That reading is wrong, too. This population is not the wreckage of a big one. It is close to the maximum that a 200-square-foot slab of sunlit limestone can support. The rarity is not damage. It is arithmetic. The habitat has always been that size, so the species has always been that size, which means the number that should worry you is not how few there are. It is how few there can ever be. There is no recovery target that gets this species to 1,000. The shelf will not allow it. Now put every constraint from this story on the table at once, because the point is not any single one of them. The reproductive habitat is a slab of rock a person could cross in 3 steps. The breathable water is a film across the top of a cave nobody has mapped to the bottom. The oxygen sits at levels that would be flagged as a kill event anywhere else, and falls further every night before dawn. The food supply runs on a beam of sunlight that clears the rim for part of the year and then goes away. The animals live about 12 months, which means the species hands itself off completely every year with nothing held in reserve. The genetic variation available to them is nearly gone and cannot be replenished because nothing gets in. The water level that determines the size of their world is controlled by an aquifer they cannot sense, recharged over thousands of years, and reachable by anyone with a well. A fault rupturing across an ocean can wash their spawning surface clean in 20 minutes. And a predator that flew in through the air once cannot be removed. Not one of those is survivable in the way that a species usually survives things. By having margin, by having options, by having somewhere else to be. There is no margin anywhere in this system. There is no second shelf, no cooler layer, no upstream refuge, no dormant stage, no reserve generation, no genetic reservoir. Every variable that a species normally keeps some slack in has been pulled to the limit and pinned there. That is the answer to the title, and it is not the one the title implies. They do not survive the hottest place on Earth by being tough. They survive by having every requirement of their existence stripped down to the absolute minimum, and then met exactly in one location, without interruption, for as long as they have been there, which is what makes them useful in a way nobody intended. Watch that pool for long enough, and you are not really watching fish, you are watching a readout. The count on the shelf responds to the water level. The water level responds to pressure in a regional aquifer spread beneath southern Nevada. That aquifer responds to recharge in mountains 50 miles away, to extraction from wells, to decades of climate in a watershed no one can see. All of it invisible, all of it underground, all of it happening on timescales, longer than any monitoring program, and it surfaces, legibly, as a number of small blue fish over a slab of limestone. That is why this pool has been instrumented for over half a century. That is why the water level has its own marker on the rock and its own Supreme Court decision. Devil's Hole is a gauge on a hidden system, and the pupfish are the needle. When the needle drops, something is happening down there that we would otherwise have no way of seeing. It also functions as a seismometer, sloshing in response to earthquakes on the other side of the planet. A hole in the Nevada desert that reads the aquifer and the Earth's crust at the same time. The fish did not sign up for this. They are just the most sensitive thing in the instrument. So here is the last reframe, and it inverts everything we started with. The desert looked like the enemy. It is not. The desert is the wall. 40 miles of dry ground in every direction is the reason no competitor ever swam in. No predatory fish ever arrived. No disease ever crossed over from another watershed. That hostile, empty, brutal landscape is the only reason this species has had the quiet it needed to persist with 35 individuals and almost no genetic variation left. The heat did not endanger them. The heat kept everything else out, which is exactly why the things that have actually threatened this species did not come from the desert at all. They came through the wall or under it. A pump, 20 miles away. A beetle with wings. 3 men with a ladder's worth of ambition at 2 in the morning. Seismic waves that do not recognize stone as an obstacle. The wall was never a wall. It was a filter. And it stopped biology while letting physics and people walk straight through. Go back to the pool one more time. It is late in the season. The sun has come around far enough to drop a shaft of light down through the slot, and for a few hours it lands on the shelf. The algae on the rock are lit. Small blue fish move over the surface in short, economical bursts, doing the only thing they have ever needed to do. Turn a few hours of angled sunlight into another generation before the light goes. The beam slides off the edge of the shelf. The rock goes dark, and below it the water continues down, past the last of the light, past the depth where anyone has been able to follow, into a flooded cave connected to a body of ancient water that no one has ever seen the shape of. A system large enough to hold a wave when the far side of the world moves. There is one more thing worth taking out of that pool, and it has nothing to do with fish. Almost everything in this story exists because somebody decided decades ago to keep measuring the same small things in the same way, year after year, long before anyone could say what those numbers would eventually be good for. A water level, a temperature, a head count on a shelf. That is unglamorous work. In most years, it produces nothing at all. It is also the only reason the decline of the 1960s was visible as a decline rather than as normal variation. The only reason the crash of the early 2010s could be recognized while there was still time to act on it. And the only reason anyone can say with confidence what that population looked like before the pumps went in. Without the record, the fish would still have been dying. Nobody would have been able to prove it. There would have been no case, no ruling, no line drawn on a rock wall. Only an argument between people who wanted the water and people with a feeling that something was going wrong underground. We can count every member of that species in a single afternoon on a slab of rock we could walk across in 3 steps. We still cannot tell you how deep their own water goes, or how much longer it will be there.